The HOA tried to steal the house my grandmother left me, so I took down their president and took back my home. They called it abandoned, listed it without my consent, and tried to sell it behind my back. But I gathered receipts, exposed their lies, and found proof the president had a financial stake in the sale. We went to court, got her removed, and elected someone who actually cared about the community. Now I live in my grandmother's house, free, proud, and exactly where I belong. I never imagined I'd be the one to inherit my grandmother's house. When I got the call from the attorney's office, I just sat there for a few minutes, staring at the wall like I'd misheard them. My grandmother, Evelyn Parker, had been the soul of our small family. She was the one who remembered birthdays without a Facebook reminder, the one who always kept a pie cooling on the windowsill during summer holidays, and the one who made every Thanksgiving feel like magic even if half the family barely got along. Her place was a modest 3-bedroom house nestled on a tree-lined street in a quiet suburb called Willow Creek. It had that classic American charm: white picket fence, a wraparound porch with a porch swing that squeaked just a little, and flower beds she'd tend to every Saturday morning. For as long as I could remember, that house had been the heart of our family, the one place that still felt like home no matter where life had pulled us. When she passed away unexpectedly, I was crushed. She'd been my anchor, always there with the right words, a home-cooked meal, or just a comforting presence when life got messy. Losing her felt like someone had pulled the rug out from under me, and for a while, I didn't know how to process it. The news that she'd left the house to me in her will hit like a wave. It was touching, of course, but overwhelming too. I lived in a small apartment in the city, juggling deadlines as a freelance graphic designer, trying to stay ahead of rent and burnout. Owning a house, especially that house, was never in my immediate plans. At first, I didn't know what to feel. It was a gift, sure, but it also came with questions I wasn't ready to answer. Would I leave the city? Could I even afford to maintain it? Would being there without her just make it hurt more? But the more I thought about it, the more the idea began to grow on me. I started picturing what it could be like to live there, not as a memory of her, but as a continuation of her story. I imagined repainting the porch, modernizing the interior, maybe even starting a small garden in her honor. Something about the idea of preserving what she built and turning it into my own space felt right, like it could be healing. So I made up my mind. I'd take the leap. I'd leave behind my cramped apartment, pack up my stuff, and move into the house that once held so much laughter, warmth, and love. I didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but at that point, all I could feel was a strange mix of sorrow and hope. The kind you only get when you're closing one chapter and opening a new one that matters. The day I pulled into the driveway of my grandmother's house for the first time since inheriting it, everything felt strange and heavy. The neighborhood looked like something out of a postcard: manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, rows of nearly identical houses with shutters all painted in variations of beige or pastel blue, and American flags swaying from perfect little porches. It was almost too perfect, like a movie set where everything was just a little too clean. As I parked in front of the garage, my eyes landed on something flapping against the front door. A stack of papers had been taped there, held down with thick strips of blue painter's tape, but the bold red letters printed across the top of each one made my chest tighten instantly. I got out and walked up the steps, feeling the porch creak under my feet. The top notice read in all caps, "Notice of Violation, Cedarwood Estates, HOA." Beneath it was a list of infractions, stuff like overgrown shrubbery, peeling mailbox paint, and missing fence panel. There was a second notice, this one marked "Final Warning," threatening fines and further legal action if the issues weren't resolved within 7 days. I stood there dumbfounded. The house had only been empty a few weeks since my grandmother passed, and while it wasn't in showroom condition, it wasn't falling apart either. I walked around to check things out myself. Sure, the shrubs were a little unruly, but nothing wild. The mailbox had a bit of chipped paint, and one panel in the backyard fence had probably fallen during a storm, but overall it just looked like a house that hadn't had someone around to keep up appearances for a short while. As I stood on the front lawn trying to absorb it all, a sharp voice cut through the quiet like a needle popping a balloon. "Excuse me, are you the owner of this property?" I turned and saw a woman marching across the street, clipboard tucked tightly under one arm, her hair styled so perfectly it looked like she had a personal stylist on call. She wore a tailored blazer, the kind that screamed authority, and her expression was pure disapproval wrapped in a polite smile. "Yes, I'm Donald," I replied, extending my hand out of habit. I just inherited the house from my grandmother. She didn't take my hand. Instead, she looked down at her clipboard as if confirming something unpleasant. "Karen Monroe," she said crisply, "president of the Cedarwood Estates Homeowners Association. We've been trying to contact the property owner for weeks. It's unacceptable to let a house fall into this kind of condition." I took a breath and tried to keep my tone even. "I just found out about the notices today. My grandmother passed recently. I'm only now getting a handle on things." Karen gave a tight-lipped smile that barely passed for sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, but there was no warmth behind the words. "But we have community standards to maintain. I trust you'll handle these violations promptly." "Yes," I said with a nod. "I'll start working on everything this week." She didn't seem satisfied. Her eyes darted to the mailbox like it personally offended her. "That paint has been chipping for months." "The fence panel?" "A complete eyesore. We can't allow this kind of neglect in Cedarwood Estates." I gritted my teeth and held on to whatever shred of politeness I had left. "Understood. I'll take care of it. Is there anything else I should know?" Karen pulled a thick booklet from her clipboard and handed it to me. "These are the HOA bylaws. Everything you need is in here. I strongly suggest you read it thoroughly. We take violations very seriously." And with that, she spun on her heels and walked away, leaving me on the porch with a handful of warnings, a rulebook thick as a small novel, and a pit growing in my stomach. I hadn't even unpacked a single box, and it already felt like I was under surveillance. This wasn't just about yard work or mailboxes, it was the beginning of something I didn't see coming. I spent the next few days knee-deep in yard clippings and paint fumes, trying to knock out every item on the violation list like I was cramming for some absurd suburban exam. I hired a landscaper to tame the shrubs, repainted the chipped mailbox with a fresh coat of deep charcoal, and ordered the lumber to fix the missing panel in the backyard fence. The work itself wasn't the hard part. It was the feeling that I was being watched every second that made everything 10 times heavier. And I wasn't imagining it either. Every time I showed up at the house, I could see Karen across the street, standing by her front window like some self-appointed neighborhood warden, clipboard always in hand, her eyes following me like she was waiting for me to mess up. At one point, I looked up while trimming the bushes, and there she was, just standing at the edge of her lawn with her arms crossed like a referee at a middle school soccer game. She didn't say anything, didn't wave, didn't even blink, just stared like my existence in the neighborhood was a problem she was determined to solve. I tried to brush it off, focusing instead on getting through the repairs and adjusting to the strange rhythm of suburban life. But just when I thought I might be turning a corner, I got an email that knocked the wind out of me. The subject line read, "Urgent. Further action required." My stomach turned as I clicked it open. Apparently, Karen, or the HOA, but let's be real, it was Karen, had added a brand new list of violations. This time, it wasn't just the basics. Now she was citing me for things like the height of the grass, literally 1 inch above standard, according to her measurement, and the color of the outdoor light fixtures, which apparently didn't conform to community aesthetic guidelines. She even tossed in a claim that the property was showing signs of abandonment, a line that made my blood boil. I was spending every spare moment working on that house. It was clear now, this wasn't about maintenance or property value. It was personal. I couldn't figure out if it was because I was the new guy, or if Karen just enjoyed throwing her weight around. But one thing was certain, she was making it her mission to micromanage every inch of that property. That week, I decided to take a day off from work and spend the full morning at the house, just to stay ahead of her. I borrowed a lawn mower from a buddy and started cutting the grass, even though it was barely taller than my ankles. I'd barely made it halfway across the yard when I caught sight of her again, this time standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching me with that same sour expression like I was vandalizing the Mona Lisa instead of mowing a lawn. She didn't say a word, just stood there like some HOA gargoyle. I pushed forward, trying not to let her get into my head, but it was like trying to ignore a siren blaring in the background. When I finished mowing, I moved on to swapping out the outdoor lights. The new ones I bought were simple and modern, sleek black metal, warm LED glow, nothing outrageous. But according to Karen's last message, the old ones were non-compliant with visual harmony, whatever that meant. While I was untangling wires and trying not to electrocute myself, an older man walked up the driveway with a slight limp and a friendly grin. He looked to be in his mid-60s, wore a weathered baseball cap, and carried the kind of calm energy that only came with age and not giving a damn anymore. "You must be Evelyn's grandson," he said, extending a hand. I'm Dave Miller. Lived next door to your grandma for over 2 decades. I shook his hand, relieved to talk to someone who wasn't holding a clipboard like a weapon. Yeah, I'm Don. It's good to meet you. Dave glanced toward Karen's house, his smile tightening a bit. Looks like Karen's already put you on the radar. I saw her out here earlier with that cursed clipboard of hers. I let out a half laugh, half groan. She's hit me with violation notices like it's a hobby. Every time I fix something, she adds 2 more problems to the list. Dave nodded with a knowing sigh. That's Karen. She's been running this HOA like it's her personal kingdom. Most of us just try to avoid her. But she's got time on her hands and a need to control every blade of grass. Once fined me for putting up Christmas lights 2 days early. Hearing that was equal parts infuriating and oddly comforting. At least I wasn't alone. I just want to get the place fixed up, move in, and live in peace, I said. Dave leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Be careful. She's got friends on the HOA board, and she'll bend every rule in the book if she thinks you're not falling in line. And if she decides you're a threat to the way she wants this neighborhood run, she doesn't back down. I thanked him for the heads up and went back to work, but now the sense of urgency had shifted into something more like quiet determination. This wasn't just about sprucing up a house anymore. It was about standing my ground. I wasn't going to let one power-tripping HOA president decide whether I belonged in the home my grandmother left me. A few days after my talk with Dave, just when I thought I might have a breather, another email from the HOA landed in my inbox, this one with the kind of subject line that made my heart sink before I even opened it. It read, Property review pending, potential nuisance classification. I stared at the screen, wondering how in the hell we'd gone from a few overgrown bushes to my grandmother's house being labeled a potential nuisance. The email rattled off a list of updated concerns, and this time they had truly lost their minds. The mulch in the flower beds was apparently the wrong color. The window trims weren't painted in approved shades of white. Even a bird feeder in the backyard was suddenly a problem because it might attract pests. And buried at the bottom was the real kicker. They were considering labeling the property as abandoned, a move that, according to the bylaws, would give them the right to intervene, issue more fines, and possibly take further corrective action. I'd been living in that house half the week, sweating through repairs, pouring time and money into bringing it back to life, and now they were saying it looked like nobody lived there? I knew what this was. It was Karen turning the screws. Every time I made progress, she found new ways to make it harder, and now she was trying to escalate things to a whole new level. That night, I stayed up going through the HOA rulebook she'd given me, highlighting anything about violations, timelines, abandoned property definitions, anything that might help me push back. According to their own rules, a property could only be declared abandoned after multiple documented attempts to reach the owner and a grace period for response. I'd received exactly one official notice before Karen started treating the place like it was a condemned building. It didn't add up, and it sure as hell didn't feel legal. The next morning, I made up my mind. I was going to that HOA meeting. I didn't care if I was the only person in the room without a blazer and a smug smirk. If Karen wanted to drag this into the open, then fine, I'd meet her head on. The meeting was held at the neighborhood's community center, a little building with folding chairs lined up in neat rows and a long table at the front where the board members sat like some kind of suburban tribunal. I walked in with a folder under my arm, filled with printouts, photos, receipts, emails, even a copy of the bylaws with my own angry highlights scribbled in the margins. The place was fuller than I expected. Neighbors filled most of the seats, a few chatting in low voices, others just watching with that passive curiosity people get when they know drama is about to unfold. Karen sat front and center, of course, wearing her signature blazer and that smug, condescending expression like she already knew the outcome. When she saw me, she gave me a nod that wasn't friendly. It was the kind of nod someone gives you when they've already decided you're the problem. The meeting started off with routine business, budget updates, announcements about some upcoming community barbecue, reminders about trash pickup schedules. I sat there, quiet, waiting for my name to come up like a defendant waiting to be called. And then Karen cleared her throat, straightened her stack of papers, and launched into it. As many of you are aware, she began, the property at 416 Willow Glen Drive has become a growing concern for the HOA. Despite repeated violations and lack of adequate upkeep, the home is now being considered for nuisance classification due to signs of neglect and abandonment. That was my cue. I stood up, folder in hand, and cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice even, but that's simply not true. I've been actively working on that house since I inherited it. I've addressed every violation that's been sent to me, and I'm making steady progress." Karen raised an eyebrow, feigning mild surprise. "We appreciate your efforts, Mr. Parker, but the property has been in a state of disrepair for months. The board must consider the impact on the neighborhood as a whole." I opened my folder and held up the printed photos. "Here's proof of what I've done. The lawn is trimmed, the mailbox is freshly painted, the broken fence panel has been replaced. I even swapped out the light fixtures to match your aesthetic standards, as vague as they were. I have receipts for everything, and emails showing I've responded to the HOA." The room started to shift. People who had been quiet now whispered to each other, some clearly nodding in my direction. I caught sight of Dave sitting a few rows back, arms crossed, giving me a small, approving nod. "And according to your own bylaws," I added, flipping to the highlighted page, "declaring a property abandoned requires multiple attempts to contact the owner, plus a formal grace period." I got one notice before the HOA started escalating this. That doesn't line up. Karen's lips tightened, but before she could respond, one of the board members, an older woman with silver hair and glasses, cleared her throat. "Karen, if he's got documentation and proof that the home's being maintained, I think we should table this matter until we've reviewed everything properly." Karen hesitated, her jaw tightening ever so slightly before she gave a stiff nod. "Fine, we'll review the materials." But her glare told me this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. As the meeting wrapped up and people started to file out, Dave gave me a pat on the back and a low chuckle. "Nice job standing your ground," he said. "But just be ready, she doesn't back off easily." I nodded, already feeling the weight of what was coming. I had one around, maybe, but the real fight was just getting started. It was the morning after the HOA meeting, and I drove to the house with a little more confidence than usual. For once, I felt like I wasn't being steamrolled, like maybe, just maybe, reason was going to prevail. I had my list of repairs, a few errands to run at the hardware store, and even planned to grab a sandwich from the corner deli for lunch and eat it on the porch like a normal person. But when I turned onto Willow Glen Drive and pulled up to the house, everything in me froze. Right there on the front lawn, like a slap in the face, was a bright red "For Sale" sign, planted at an angle and staked deep into the soil. Underneath the words "Under Contract" were the logo and contact info for a local real estate agency. For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind, that maybe someone had stuck it there by mistake or as a sick prank, but as I got out of the car and walked up to it, I realized it was real, professionally printed, firmly installed, and definitely not a joke. My jaw clenched so hard I felt my teeth ache. I hadn't listed the house. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't even spoken to a real estate agent. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone and dialed the number listed on the sign. A chipper voice answered almost immediately. "Maple Ridge Realty. This is Michelle. How can I help you today?" I forced the words out calmly, even though my pulse was racing. "Hi. I'm calling about 416 Willow Glen Drive. There's a for sale sign in the yard, and I'm the owner. I never authorized any sale." There was a pause on the other end, one of those long, nervous silences that says something's wrong. Let me transfer you to the agent managing that listing." A few seconds later, another voice came on, this one more professional, but still uncertain. "Hi, this is Mia Dawson. I'm the agent for 416 Willow Glen. How can I help?" I didn't sugarcoat it. "You can help by explaining how my house ended up listed without my permission." Another pause, this one even longer. "According to our paperwork, the Cedarwood Estates Homeowners Association authorized the listing due to the property being classified as abandoned," she said, slowly and carefully, like she already knew how this conversation was going to go. "I'm sorry, but everything we've done has been through the documents they provided." My grip tightened around the phone. "That's a lie. I've been living in and working on that house for weeks. There's nothing abandoned about it. I want the sign down immediately and the listing pulled." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Parker," she said, her voice now sounding a little shakier, "but I suggest you take it up with the HOA directly. I can't remove the listing unless I get formal notice." I hung up without saying another word, my hands shaking not from fear, but from the kind of fury that comes when you know someone's crossed a line they can't walk back from. This wasn't just harassment. This was war. I drove straight to the HOA office, barely registering the turns or traffic lights. Karen's car was in her usual reserved spot, sitting there like a smug monument to her arrogance. I walked in, didn't even bother knocking, and found her in her office typing something with that same holier-than-thou expression she always wore. "Donald," she said with a fake smile. "What a surprise." "Cut the crap," I snapped. "Why is my house listed for sale?" She didn't flinch. If anything, she looked satisfied. "The board voted to classify your property as abandoned," she said, voice smooth as butter. "Under Section 9.3 of the bylaws, we have the authority to take corrective measures in such cases. That includes listing the home to protect community standards." I stepped closer and dropped a stack of documents on her desk, copies of emails, photos, receipts, everything I'd been compiling. "You had no legal right to do that. I've been maintaining that house. I've responded to every violation. You skipped protocol, ignored the bylaws, and now you've crossed into illegal territory." For a split second, her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "You're welcome to challenge the decision if you feel it's unjust." "Oh, I will," I said, turning to leave. "And when this is over, you're going to regret trying to steal my house." That same day, I contacted a lawyer. I didn't want to wait. I needed someone who specialized in HOA disputes, someone who knew exactly how to dismantle people like Karen. I found Beatrice Preston, a sharp, seasoned attorney who didn't blink once as I laid out the situation. "They put your home up for sale without your signature?" she asked, eyes narrowing. "Let's get to work." Within 48 hours, Beatrice had filed a cease and desist order to halt the sale and began the legal process to challenge the HOA's actions. She subpoenaed the board's meeting records, internal emails, and documentation surrounding the so-called abandonment claim. And what we found was worse than I expected. Turns out, Karen had contacted the real estate agency before the board even met to vote on the matter. She had already begun the listing process behind closed doors and then retroactively pressured the board to approve it. On top of that, we uncovered that she had a financial interest in the real estate firm she used. Her sister-in-law owned it, and Karen stood to earn a percentage of the sale if it went through. It was a bombshell. In the moment we knew what we were dealing with, I stopped being afraid of her. This wasn't just about one woman on a power trip. This was full-blown misconduct. I didn't know what Karen thought was going to happen, but I wasn't going anywhere. This was my house. And now, it was personal. Word spreads fast in quiet neighborhoods, and once people found out the HOA tried to sell my house without my permission, the whispers started turning into voices. At first, it was just a couple of neighbors who stopped me while I was raking leaves or repainting the porch, folks I hadn't even spoken to before. They'd say things like, "I heard what happened, that's not right," or "Karen's pulled stuff like this before, but this time she went too far." One by one, stories started surfacing, tiny injustices that had piled up over the years. A family fined for hanging Halloween decorations too early. A woman charged $100 because her trash bin was out past the tower window. Another neighbor told me Karen once ordered someone to repaint their shutters because the shade of blue clashed with the neighborhood's character. None of these stories had made waves before. Everyone just sort of dealt with it, rolled their eyes, and tried not to get on our radar. But now, seeing someone fight back and expose what she was doing gave people a kind of energy I hadn't expected. Even Dave, my next-door neighbor, started speaking out at the HOA meetings. He was the kind of guy who usually kept to himself, but now he was sitting in the front row, asking hard questions and refusing to let Karen brush things off. Then came the moment that changed everything. Beatrice, my lawyer, had the idea of going public. She said the more people knew, the harder it would be for Karen to hide behind bylaws and technicalities. I was nervous at first. The last thing I wanted was to turn this into a public spectacle, but she was right. If Karen was going to pull stunts like this in the dark, the best way to stop her was to drag it all into the light. So I agreed. A local news station picked up the story. They aired a segment titled, "HOA President Under Fire, Homeowner Battles Alleged Overreach in Willow Glen." It was surreal watching myself on TV, standing on my grandmother's porch, pointing out the for sale sign and explaining how I'd been blindsided. The reporter also interviewed neighbors, and man, people didn't hold back. Dave talked about the time Karen fined him for trimming a tree without her permission, even though the tree was on his own lawn. Another woman recounted being threatened with penalties over flower colors. The segment painted a clear picture of a woman who'd ruled the neighborhood through fear, rules, and intimidation for years, and now, finally, people were done with it. After that, everything changed. People who'd never dared question Karen before started organizing. A woman named Rachel lived a few blocks over, knocked on my door with a clipboard and a determined look on her face. She introduced herself, said she saw the news piece, and that she and a small group were collecting signatures to call for a special HOA election. Under the bylaws, if they got enough homeowners to sign, they could trigger a vote to replace Karen as president. "We need someone to help rally support," she said. you've already got people's attention. If you're willing to share your story at a few house meetings, it could really push this forward. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds before nodding. I didn't ask for any of this, but if I could help stop Karen from doing this to someone else, it was worth it. Over the next week, I found myself sitting in living rooms and backyards, surrounded by folding chairs and bowls of chips, telling my story to groups of neighbors who were tired of being treated like trespassers on their own lawns. People shared more stories, aired their frustrations, and by the end of each gathering, more names ended up on Rachel's petition. Karen must have felt the shift because she didn't stay quiet. Suddenly she was everywhere, walking door to door, hosting surprise inspections, and handing out citations for things like mailboxes being too rustic or garden gnomes being a visual distraction. She fined a family with toddlers for having a swing set that wasn't pre-approved. Every desperate move she made only confirmed what people already suspected, that she was losing control and trying to cling to it with both hands. But it was too late. The tide had turned, and no amount of threats or policy talk could stop it. What started as my personal battle had become something bigger, something that was finally waking up a community that had been quietly bullied for far too long. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I wasn't fighting it alone. By the time Rachel's petition reached the required number of signatures, the neighborhood was buzzing with something it hadn't felt in years: hope. The HOA board had no choice but to schedule a special election. According to the bylaws, they had 30 days to set a date, notify residents, and prepare for a vote that could change everything. And at the center of it all stood two names: Karen Monroe, the reigning queen of Cedarwood Estates, and Rebecca Baker, a quiet but sharp-minded neighbor who'd stepped up to challenge her. Rebecca wasn't flashy or loud. She didn't walk around with clipboards or hide behind bylaws. She just listened. She had been to every one of the meetings we held, taking notes, asking questions, and nodding along when people spoke. When she officially announced her candidacy, it wasn't with some dramatic speech. It was a simple post on the community bulletin board, outlining her goals: fairness, transparency, and bringing some damn peace back to our lives. And that was all people needed to hear. Election day felt like a festival and a standoff all in one. The community center was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. People brought their kids, their dogs, their lawn chairs. Some stood in line in their gardening gloves and paint-splattered shirts, like they'd come straight from chores just to cast their votes. As I walked in, I saw familiar faces: Dave, Rachel, neighbors I only knew by house color or mailbox style, all smiling, nodding, clapping me on the back. Even people who had stayed quiet for months were now here to have a say. We weren't just voting, we were reclaiming something. Karen was already there when I arrived, standing stiffly near the front of the room with her usual entourage, her lips stretched into a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her usual calm was cracked now, the confidence chipped. She watched as person after person lined up, signed their names, and slipped their ballots into the locked box. Rebecca, on the other hand, looked like the very definition of composure. She stood among everyone, chatting casually, laughing, offering kind words. There was no campaign slogan, no flyers or flashy pins, just her, fully present and human. When the votes were finally counted, the room went silent as one of the election committee members stepped forward with the results in hand. "Thank you all for participating," he said, clearing his throat. "After tallying the votes, we are pleased to announce that Rebecca Baker has been elected as the new president of the Cedarwood Estates Homeowners Association." The place erupted. Applause, whistles, high fives. People hugged each other like they just won a state championship. And then all eyes turned toward Karen. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. She simply stood there, her face pale and unreadable, then gathered her things and walked out the back without a word. No farewell speech, no final threat. Just a quiet, unceremonious exit, like the curtain had finally closed on her reign. The days that followed were unlike anything I'd seen since I arrived in Cedarwood. Rebecca got straight to work. She called an emergency board meeting to review and revise the most outdated and oppressive HOA policies. Fines for petty violations were suspended. An appeals process was put in place so people could challenge unfair citations. And then, in a moment I never saw coming, she issued a formal apology to me. The HO reimbursed my legal fees, and Rebecca personally thanked me for standing my ground and helping spark the change the neighborhood had needed for years. I didn't become president. I didn't run for anything. But for the first time since I inherited my grandmother's house, I felt like I truly belonged there, not just in the home, but in the community. And not because someone handed me permission, but because we fought for it together. The weeks after the election felt like a season change, not just in the weather, but in the air, in the way neighbors waved, and how people stopped to talk instead of just nodding from their porches. Cedarwood Estates was breathing again, and I could finally focus on what I'd set out to do in the first place: finish the house. No more surprise violations, no more hostile stares from across the street, no more fighting off legal threats just for hanging wind chimes or repainting shutters. Now it was just me, a to-do list, and a quiet sense of peace I hadn't felt since inheriting the place. I spent my weekends repainting the trim, replanting the flower beds, and fixing up the old porch swing my grandma used to sit on every evening with a glass of sweet tea. I replaced broken tiles in the bathroom, hung up framed photos of her in the hallway, and filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh bread on Sundays, something she used to do that always made the place feel like home. Every nail I drove in, every corner I cleaned, it wasn't just about restoring the house, it was about preserving her spirit. Neighbors started coming by more often, not with complaints, but with stories. Stories about how Evelyn used to babysit their kids or bring over soup when someone was sick, how she used to organize potlucks on the lawn or sneak extra candy into Halloween buckets. Turns out, she'd been the heart of this place long before Karen ever held a clipboard. One by one, people helped me bring that spirit back. Dave lent me tools. Rachel helped me set up a garden in the backyard. Rebecca stopped by now, and then just to check in, clipboard in hand, but hers was filled with ideas, not infractions. When the last of the repairs were finished and the house finally felt like mine, I decided to do something small to celebrate. I invited the people who'd stood by me through everything: Rebecca, Dave, Rachel, and a few others who had become more than neighbors. That Saturday night, we gathered in the backyard under a canopy of string lights, with cold drinks, folding chairs, and music playing softly from an old speaker I'd found in the attic. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. It was real. It was home. As the sun set and the sky turned deep orange, Rebecca raised her glass and smiled. "You've done an incredible job with this place," she said. "Your grandmother would be proud." I felt my throat tighten as I looked around at the house, the garden, the people. "I think she'd be happy to see what we built here," I said. "And I couldn't have done it without all of you." Dave clapped me on the back and gave a half grin. "You didn't just fix up a house, son. You reminded this place what it's supposed to feel like." That night, as the last of the guests drifted home and I sat alone on the porch with a blanket and the sounds of crickets humming around me, I thought about how far things had come. Karen Monroe had quietly sold her home and moved away just 2 weeks after the election. No big goodbye, no ceremony, just a moving truck and an empty porch. Her name faded from board meetings and bulletin boards, becoming more of a cautionary tale than a memory. And honestly, that was enough. No revenge, no spectacle, just peace. What mattered now wasn't what she took, but what we reclaimed. Cedarwood Estates wasn't perfect, but it was ours again. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. My home.